Those of you who are regular subscribers to my channel will be aware that, in the last year I've been reviewing books as part of my content creation. And that has mostly been books which are, most definitely within the confines of like body-based therapy. I think I've done some Reich, some Lowen, and have I done any Lowen? Maybe I didn't do any Lowen yet. And also some lesser known works in the field. But recently I felt moved to kind of expand, to come out of my own lane a little bit, not totally out of my own lane, and look at some peripheral areas that also relate, as I see it, to body-based therapy, but not in such a direct way. If I'm honest, this is also partly because I really struggle to read Wilhelm Reich. I don't speak German, but I suspect that the British translations are good, and I just really struggle with it. I'm not really an academic, a big intellectual. I've got a mind, but I'm not really that type of guy, and some of his works are just too complex for me, and it seems like the investment of time is not really worth it. That's my perception. And it's also very much in the past. And it's not to say there aren't valuable things to learn from the past, but it's also quite interesting, I think, or I certainly get attracted to look towards the future as well. And with this in mind, I came across this book, which has just been published earlier this year, called Future Superhuman by Elise Bohan. I actually came across it because a chap who's not really a body-based therapist, but someone who's really into the body and passion and emotions that I follow on Substack, had written some comment that, this book was pretty much the work. I'm not quite sure if he used the phrase Antichrist, but it was certainly pretty strong, his description of this book. And that actually just really piqued my interest. And I thought, wow, what is this guy like? What is this guy kicking off about? What's really triggering him in this book? So I looked it up and got hold of a copy and read it. There is, in a sense, a kind of anti-technology movement going on a bit in the background of some areas of like Western intelligentsia, and it's a perspective I can understand. It does feel a bit sometimes like we're living in some kind of technological determinism, which means like, technology is running the world and we're just kind of trying to fit in with what it can do. And so there has been this kind of pushback from some areas against technology. And in particular, I was very moved a number of years ago by a chap in San Francisco called Scott Alexander, who'd written this piece, Meditations on Moloch. And Moloch, like the kind of, you often see this image of the machine trying to take over the world. Moloch was like some kind of ancient Carthaginian deity that Allen Ginsberg had constructed a poem partly about. And this chap wrote this really moving story about like where actually technology is taking us. You can look it up if you're interested. Just Google Scott Alexander Meditations on Moloch. But I found it a very moving and powerful piece. And, it hit me with real future shock about where is humanity really going to. And what I really like about Elise Bohan's new book is that it's very rational, very direct, and it just looks at certain specific areas of the future where we have good data, where we already kind of know what's happening and she just extends it to say, okay, it's moving towards here. I think in the past, a lot of writers about the future can go into a kind of science fiction kind of thing where they just go off somewhere and we don't really know if of course the future could be any number of things, So what I really appreciate about Elise's book is that she really sticks to stuff that we can start to see, at least with some degree of clarity, where we're moving. Before I talk about her book, just to mention Elise herself, she's a young Australian woman in her early 30s, I believe, and she's involved with a very interesting organisation which comes out of Oxford University called the Future of Humanity Institute, which has got some really quite, it sounds a little bit like something out of Doctor Strange. All these kind of very, very intelligent men and women who are looking, what does the future look like, and covering different areas of it. Transhumanism, existential risk, AI, this kind of thing. It's kind of a fascinating, you can look them up online, there's some fascinating people in there. Several of whom I recognise from stuff I've read before. Nick Bostrom, I think, heads it, and he wrote a book called Superintelligence years ago, which was like the first book actually that looked at AI safety and that really brought it out into the kind of world of academia. There was another guy, also an Australian actually, called Toby Ord, I believe, who's written a really interesting book about existential risk and actually looking, actually doing hard data crunching as much as is possible on what existential threats really are, because we're also surrounded by a lot of kind of media and different pundits telling us this is a massive risk, and other ones saying this is a massive risk and this isn't a massive risk, and stuff like that. So I'm actually listening to that book on Audible at the moment. But this review is about Elise's book, and she's also attached to the same institution, which I think does give her good credibility. Another thing to mention about Elise is that she's a dyed-in-the-wool transhumanist, as far as I can tell, in that she really believes that humanity must harness technology quite a deep level in order to survive and move forwards and to continue evolving. She's pretty clear about that, and so she's also presenting a case as to why we must embrace technology and continue moving forwards, and doesn't give so much space to the idea that maybe we could kind of switch off technology a little bit or something like that. So I do feel in her book, there's a bit of a rapid segue from humanity is facing all these existential threats, and the way forward must be this. Rather than kind of hanging out a little bit more longer with like humanity is facing existential threats, let's examine our possibilities. Anyway, perhaps I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's come first to the actual content of the book and the areas that Elise covers. And I think a really good point that Elise makes early on is like, we've kind of, I've definitely had the sense that transhumanism has kind of drifted off my radar, and that it's not out in the world so much, it's not so much talked about it. I remember like 5-10 years ago, there was this kind of Humanity Plus organization and all sorts of kind of life extension kind of technologies and AI stuff, integrating chips into the human brain, and people were super into this in San Francisco or something like this. And then that's kind of dropped off a bit. And so I think to the casual observer, just consuming media here and there, you could get the impression that transhumanism has kind of dropped a little bit or disappeared or something. But Elise makes the point that this probably really isn't the case, and it's more that it's gone a little bit underground, and that actually, the people who are really running our world, or certainly moving towards the future of our world, are these big tech corporations like Facebook, Google, individual entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. And that these guys, when you look at their agenda and what they're doing, are very strongly transhumanists. Elon, for example, is basically Neuralink, one of his companies, is looking at implanting chips in the brain and to work out if we can create like a kind of human brain AI interface. Initially that's going to be done to support people with certain disabilities in the spine or the vision system and that kind of thing. But he's quite open about it. His aim is to actually see if we can create like human cyborgs. Mark Zuckerberg, head of Facebook, has also been very clear that he wants to develop VR, virtual reality, and augmented reality. So Elise makes his point like, a lot of the transhumanist agenda is still advancing, but it's kind of going on a little bit beneath the surface, and the average citizen is probably not really aware of it. And having made this point that transhumanism is still progressing, but it's more behind the scenes and it's not called transhumanism anymore, Elise begins to build a case, looking at the lot of the average human being on the planet, and the fact that, our brain is the product of biological evolution, natural selection, and it's not really very well suited for the modern world. We easily get into kind of hierarchical battles or kind of, competitive instincts, and it's really not easy for us to be genuinely altruistic or, to simply move forwards in a good direction. Even now, like July 2022, there's a huge conflict going on in Ukraine, and there's talk about nuclear war in the background and all these kind of things. And, I, for one, and I suspect a lot of people kind of thought we'd got beyond that stage and stuff like that. And it's clear that we haven't. The brains that we've got are still very much locked into these kind of dominance hierarchies, battles and fighting. And more concerning, when we are triggered, we kind of lose access to our rational functions. The threat that's perceived by the amygdala switches off our access to rationality a lot of the time. And so we just go into these kind of automatic, defensive or attacking behaviors. and that this is essentially a huge issue given the kind of world that we're facing and the kind of level of existential threats which are now emerging. I think up to 1945, pretty much every threat that humanity faced came from the outside. And that post-1945, they all pretty much came from the inside. And of course, in 1945 was when the US ended World War II by dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japanese cities. And at that point, and moving forwards from there, really, the majority of threats that humans have faced have not come from the outside. They've come from ourselves. Global warming, climate change is mostly due to humans, including the way we farm animals. Even things like pandemics, maybe examples of problems we're creating from within through our researching of flu viruses and gain-of-function research and bioweapons. We don't know for sure. But certainly in terms of trying to deal with a pandemic and, organize a coherent response, it's not easy given the type of brain that we have and the speed with which our access to kind of rationality is locked off. And we may simply go into other defensive behaviours of just agreeing to do whatever authority wants or just totally resisting whatever authority wants. Also considering the development and deployment of like artificial intelligence, AI, it's clear that there's a thing called the alignment problem, where we might think that we've programmed the AI to do a certain task, but we haven't quite made its programming tight enough that it won't veer off and just like basically decimate humanity. Scaling, recursive optimization, these kind of things. And it's like, with the world so kind of competitive, with companies trying to make money, a company might simply deploy an AI without really testing it to make sure it's properly in alignment. And then, it's deploying it because it wants to get a tactical advantage over its competitors. But this AI then just, takes over and just does some really bad stuff in the world. And in fact, as Elise points out, the threat from like homemade bioweapons, pandemics, or unaligned AI is about 100 times greater than the existential risk associated with climate change. And by that I mean that it's currently estimated that climate change is 1,000 to 1 existential threat for humanity over the next century, i.e. not a huge threat, not to be ignored, but not a huge threat, whereas homemade bioweapons or unaligned AI is about 10 to 1. So we can see that even in the field of assessing existential threats and governments taking action, the human brain again is not really doing necessarily a particularly good job, or the situation may change faster than it can easily adapt, especially when a response is required from a large number of human beings or even the whole globe. Another example of a situation where we're having difficulty because of our brain is in the level of kind of stigma that's been attached with nuclear power, nuclear power stations and using nuclear power to create electricity. Because of originally Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then things like Chernobyl and Fukushima, many humans have like taken this kind of Greta Thunberg type attitude that nuclear power is just bad and we shouldn't be using it, when actually all the kind of rational science is saying actually these days it's really, really safe and way less of a risk than pretty much any other form of power that we've thus far developed. So these are all examples of areas where the human brain is, just because of its evolutionary ancestry, is just really, really unsuitable for dealing with some of the risks that are arising, most of which are coming through our development of tech. So having built up the kind of, the problem and really made it kind of clear, Elise moves on to looking at things like life extension, which is a burgeoning kind of industry where scientists are looking at ways to extend human life. To the fact that in the future, people have been saying this since the 70s, but we may be moving into a kind of post-work society where machine intelligence, AI, basically starts to take over a lot of the tasks, and what do we actually do with the humans? And that this also kind of crosses over into dating, forging sexual relationships and having kids. Because from our DNA, women have a bit of a tendency to all chase after a small group of men who they perceive as dominant and capable, and the rest of the men get left a bit in the background somewhere, along with large numbers of women who don't basically manage to grab one of the good ones. And what do we do with all these guys? Both women and men. And this leads on to examining sex bots, artificial humans or partly artificial humans, silicon constructs with some level of kind of mind and genitalia that men and women can have sexual interactions with. And whilst, a lot of people think this won't go very far and it'll just be a few isolated people who get into it, she takes a position, and I kind of agree, that actually that they can pretty much take over for a lot of men, and when their intelligence is probably an emotional intelligence is developed a bit more for women too. For me, just looking out at the world and the level of animosity now between men and women, it's kind of like, well, okay, the top kind of 5% might just get off with each other and have kids, but the rest maybe will just be sort of give up seeking someone that they want from what they perceive as pretty meager resources out there in the human world, and just get into silicon. Especially as time goes on and AI develops, and like in that Joaquin Phoenix movie, you've got AI in silicon, which basically can have quite intelligent level relationships with human beings. And this kind of moves from there into the reality that actually today's generation of young adults, people in their late teens and 20s, seem less interested in love relationships and sex. They're more interested in staying safe and interacting via screens, via mobile apps. And actually to go out and take a risk with dating is less popular now than it ever has been. So in reality, sex and procreation are kind of going out of style. Babies are kind of on the way out, and life extension is on the way in. Meaning perhaps that in 50 years, global population will peak, 9-10 billion, and then will start to fall off quite sharply. Already the rate at which many human cultures in the West and in Asia are reproducing is way slower than the amount of people that are dying off. So the future already looks like, as I say, less babies but longer life for those who do exist. And I was not myself really aware, and I was quite hit by this. I don't have kids myself, so I don't feel quite as attached to it as some people may do, but I think a lot of people don't really realise just how much population may be starting to fall off towards the turn of this century, and just how rare it may become for women to have babies. Related to this, Elise also writes about artificial wombs. I'm obviously not a woman, but I can imagine that going through childbirth is really quite a huge thing. It often seems, from the women I know that I've talked to and who've been through it, like pretty much the biggest thing they ever did, and they don't regret it in any way, but it was still a massive thing, and that perhaps, Elise says, given the opportunity, many women would choose to have like an artificial womb and grow a child in that. Now, all of this for me was like basically quite strong future shock. I really felt like, whoa, it hit me for a day and a half, and I was quite in some processing of it all, even though I'm quite familiar with a lot of these strands and themes. To have them presented so starkly, like right in my face, was like, whoa, like no, hardly any babies, and those which are born are kind of maybe coming out of artificial wombs, and then like loads of and then relatively low numbers of people compared to today's world, and they're all living much longer. Like I say, it hit me quite hard. And I don't think Elise mentions this in her book, but of course we have to factor in the fact that we just have, from our evolution again of the brain, a certain visceral negative reaction to certain situations. Eating food which is bad, may not kill us, but we have this strong visceral reaction to it because that's how our brain developed in the environment it was in at the time. And so likewise, we can have a very strong visceral reaction to certain types of future, which may be a little bit we may be ignoring a little bit their potential benefit. But with that caveat, I was still very shocked personally by it. But actually, in terms of like who I am as a person and my therapeutic work and what I'm really into, the thing that really hit me strongly was Elise's kind of perception that, future human beings are going to be kidults. They're not really going to mature or grow up. They're going to be in this state of kind of perpetual adolescence, which for me, I already see a bit of in the world. Not big time, things are just changing in the world. But I am left wondering, like in a generation or two's time, do young people get the kind of, environment that they need to develop, to really root themselves? And it's not like, in my generation back in the 70s and stuff, it was perfect, far from it. But there was still this this opportunity through work, through the rituals of work, for women through the rituals of childbirth and bringing up children from the family, from making a stone building on the earth at 90 degrees to the earth. All these things are kind of symbolic acts which over time act to mature our consciousness. They create mature human beings. And what actually disturbed me the most deeply about Elise's vision of the future was the fact that, this might be denied to us, and that we just become this race of kind of perpetual kind of teenagers somehow. And part of what is disturbing to me about that idea is it also leaves in the potential for like some kind of superarching control, which may just be my trip, but it's there. In that, I'm sure there have been forces in the world, in hierarchies at the apex, who to have a large race of relatively compliant teenagers distracted by stuff is actually a kind of fantasy for them and an ideal situation where no one ever really challenges them in any way and, no development really occurs. So that's a little bit along the lines of conspiracy stuff, but I think it's valid to talk about it because having an entire race of people who are just kidults obviously does set the potential up for that situation, even if it's not being planned for in some way, that it could still manifest. And I do feel like, in a lot of my work before, particularly with men in their 20s, that they really are struggling to get the growth situations that they need to deepen and mature. Particularly in the West, the world has become very orientated around comfort, staying safe and feeling comfortable, and that's okay. We can create openness from that, but we can't create much depth and grounding. We can't create much rootedness. We stay in this kind of slightly open, kidult kind of phase. So looking back from like a few days ago when I finished this book, this is the main strand that has been going on for me. And developing that area a little bit more around maturity and just creating mature adult human beings, which to me is like very, very important. I don't say that we necessarily need to, own houses, that we necessarily need to have children, that we necessarily need to have jobs. But if we don't have those things, then we're going to need something to replace them. We're going to need some other process that a child can go through to achieve adulthood, to achieve maturity. And without that, then to me the world looks very bleak indeed. So that really is my take on Elise's book, Future Superhuman, which I'm very grateful for having read. My only slight kind of little bits of critical input will be around, as I mentioned before, this kind of rapid segue from, building up the problems that our brain has of coping with the existential risks that are rapidly coming to jumping into, we need to keep going in this direction straight away. I think it's also valid to hang out, if we actually get the chance as a species to do that and discuss what are our options moving forward and do we really want this future? I also found at times, Elise, she's obviously a caring person, but there's also a little bit of provocation in there. I sense, and this is just my take, that she kind of enjoys provoking people a little bit, and she uses the term like a meat sack for the human body and does so with some apparent delight. And I'm kind of a little bit like, well, as a therapist, I actually just work with the sense of the body as an aspect or component of our kind of, moment by moment consciousness and the value of that. I don't bother with so much self-image and that kind of thing. But certainly regarding my body as a meat sack, to me would be a kind of a negative. It would indicate some form of dissociative or negativity towards the body that's possibly not born purely through a rational understanding of its limitations. So I don't know if that's true for Elise, but that's something that I vaguely pick up in the background. But overall, I feel that this book is really, really an important book to read, to be quite honest, because it just starts to open up a dialogue. I do think that Elise is correct that, big tech is moving forwards. There's no discussion about where it's going. It's actually looking like pretty extreme, and we need people to just discuss these things. And that does start from someone like Elise, who has the drive and the desire to just really be rational and put things out in the world. So I'm very grateful to Elise for writing this book, and I thoroughly recommend that you check it out. Thank you for listening to my review.